In 1992, Robert Ballard sent a camera down into the darkness northwest of Savo Island. 800 feet down, then 1,000, then 2,000, and then there she was. The bow of USS Laffey, sitting upright on the sea floor, exactly as she had settled on the night of November 13th, 1942. Her forward guns still trained to port, still pointed at the last target she ever fired on. Nobody moved them. Nobody ever could. Ballard had found the Titanic 7 years before that. He'd mapped the ocean floor from the Arctic to the Pacific. But he said later that nothing quite prepared him for what he found in that patch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Because the Laffey wasn't alone. Scattered across that sea floor, layered on top of each other in some places, were the remains of dozens of warships, American destroyers, Japanese battleships, an Australian heavy cruiser. Some of them had never been found. Some of them, nobody was even sure exactly where they went down. The people who live on those islands today, the Solomon Islanders, they don't swim here. They call it the Deadwater. The U.S. Navy has a different name, Ironbottom Sound. And here is what happened in this place. In the space of 3 months, August, October, November 1942, Japan sent 3 of its greatest admirals down into these waters. Each one had been hand-picked by Yamamoto himself. Each one won his battle that night, and every single one of them failed the same way. Their names were Mikawa, Abe, and Kondō. This is their story, and the story of the ships down there. Now, if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know Henderson Field. You know what it was. You know why it mattered. You know that as long as those planes kept flying off that runway, no Japanese ship could move through these waters in daylight without paying for it. So I'm not going to walk you through that again. What I want to talk about instead is something different. Something that I think gets lost in almost every telling of this story. Japan knew. Yamamoto was not a naive man. He had spent 2 years in the United States. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd watched American shipyards the way a chess player watches his opponent's hands. He knew what this country could build, and how fast it could build it, in a way that very few men in Tokyo truly understood. And by the fall of 1942, he was deeply, privately alarmed. In a letter to a fellow admiral, he didn't mince words. He wrote that the situation at Guadalcanal was, in his words, far more serious than anything Japan had faced since the siege of Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War. Port Arthur. If you know your history, you know what that comparison meant. Port Arthur was the defining crisis of that entire war, the siege that nearly broke Japan before it had barely begun. Yamamoto was telling his colleagues, "This is that bad. This is that serious." And yet, he kept sending ships. He kept sending men. He kept sending his best admirals down into that sound. The same sound he knew would swallow them if they weren't out before sunrise. Why? Because Japan was not losing a battle. Japan was losing a race. Every week that Henderson Field stayed open, American transports were delivering more men, more ammunition, more aviation fuel to Guadalcanal. Every month that passed, another Essex-class carrier was sliding off the ways at a shipyard in Newport News, or Quincy, or Puget Sound. America was building ships faster than Japan could sink them. Japan had no equivalent. They had no industrial reserve that deep. They had brilliant engineers and superbly trained crews and some of the finest warships ever built. But they did not have what America had, which was factory floor after factory floor, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, turning out hulls and engines and guns as if the country itself had decided that losing simply was not acceptable. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone in Tokyo, and that understanding made his position impossible. He could not afford to wait. Every week he hesitated was a week the balance shifted further. Every night those planes flew off Henderson Field was another night. Japanese supply ships couldn't reach their starving soldiers on the island. There was no option that didn't carry an enormous cost. So he sent his admirals in, one after another, knowing the odds, knowing the trap, knowing the price. But here is the thing that nobody asked, and this is the part of this story that I think almost nobody talks about. What exactly were those admirals sent to do? The answer sounds simple. Get into Ironbottom Sound, shell Henderson Field, get out before dawn. One night, in and out, hit the airfield hard enough to put it out of commission, at least long enough for the troop convoys to land safely. That was the mission. And there's a detail buried right there in the middle of that mission, a detail so obvious that nobody in Tokyo seemed to notice it, that made failure almost inevitable before a single ship ever left Rabaul. They were each given one night. One night to do something that, as it turned out, could not be done in one night. Henderson Field had been built to take a beating. It had been shelled before, bombed before. The Cactus Air Force, those pilots and crews living in tents in the mud and the heat, they had been patching that runway and pushing wrecked planes off the taxiway and getting back in the air since August. They knew how to absorb punishment and keep flying. One night of bombardment, even a heavy one, was not going to put that airfield out of commission permanently. Maybe for a few hours, maybe until the next afternoon, but not long enough, not nearly long enough, to change the strategic equation. To do that, you wouldn't need a raid. You'd need control. You'd need to own Ironbottom Sound, not for one night, but continuously. Long enough to starve the airfield of fuel and parts and replacement aircraft until it simply couldn't fight anymore. None of the 3 admirals were given that mission. None of them were asked whether the mission they were given was actually achievable. And not one of them, not Mikawa, not Abe, not Kondō, stood up in front of Yamamoto and said, "One night isn't enough. This won't work." That silence, that particular silence, is the thing that connects all 3 of them. That's where this story really begins. His name was Gunichi Mikawa, and before we talk about what he did wrong, we need to talk about what he did right. Because what he did right was one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship in the entire Pacific War. Mikawa had graduated 3rd in his class at the Japanese Naval Academy at Itajima. He was not a man who coasted. He had read Alfred Thayer Mahon's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, the foundational text of modern naval strategy, 4 times. He had spent years as an instructor at the academy, then as chief of the instructional staff. He was a student of naval warfare in the deepest sense of the word. When Guadalcanal erupted in August 1942, Yamamoto looked at the officers available in the South Pacific and chose Mikawa to command the newly formed 8th Fleet at Rabaul. That was the most critical naval command in the entire Southern Theater. That tells you everything about what Yamamoto thought of this man. On the night of August 8th, Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer down through the channel they called the Slot, moving at speed, lights off, in the dark. The Allied fleet guarding the Guadalcanal anchorage had radar. They had more ships. They had been warned that morning by an Australian reconnaissance aircraft that a Japanese force was moving south. None of it mattered. The warning report sat in the wrong inbox. The radar operators were watching for aircraft, not surface ships. The fleet had been split into 3 separate groups covering different approaches, and nobody had issued a clear battle plan for the night. Mikawa's column sliced through all of it like a knife through paper. In 33 minutes, he sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers: the USS Astoria, the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, and the Australian HMAS Canberra. He damaged 2 more ships. He didn't lose a single vessel in the actual battle. The second worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. Worse than anything since Pearl Harbor, 9 months before. Yamamoto sent a congratulatory telegram that same night. And then Mikawa did something that historians have been arguing about ever since. At 2:16 in the morning, with the Allied screening force destroyed or crippled and scattered, he called his staff together on the bridge of his flagship. In front of him, sitting in the anchorage just beyond where those 4 cruisers were now sinking, were the American transports. 16,000 Marines were still in the process of unloading. The supplies, the ammunition, the equipment that would let those men hold Guadalcanal for weeks and months. It was all still on those ships, or barely on the beach. Those transports were essentially defenseless. There was nothing left between Mikawa and them. He ordered his ships to withdraw. His reasoning was straightforward. By the time he regrouped and went after the transports, daylight would be dangerously close. And in daylight, American carrier aircraft would find him. His cruisers would be sitting ducks in open water, far from any air cover of their own. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also completely wrong. Because what Mikawa didn't know, what nobody on his staff knew, was that the American carrier task force had already left. Admiral Fletcher, concerned about his own losses and worried about Japanese submarines, had pulled his carriers south hours earlier. By the time Mikawa was standing on that bridge weighing his options, there were no carrier aircraft waiting for him. The sky would have been empty. He was afraid of a threat that had already sailed away. 16,000 Marines finished unloading. 11 days later, Henderson Field was operational. And from that morning forward, every Japanese ship that entered Ironbottom Sound in daylight faced aircraft from the runway that Mikawa had been close enough to destroy, and hadn't. The Japanese historians who examined this campaign after the war were unsparing. One called it a turning point that Japan had handed to the Americans for free. Yamamoto praised the battle. History judged the decision. We'll come back to what that decision really meant. But first, I want to tell you about a man named Hiroaki Abe. Because 3 months after Savo Island, Yamamoto needed someone to finish what Mikawa hadn't started. He needed a battleship man. Before we get there, if you're finding this story worth your time, a like on this video genuinely helps, not for the number itself, but because it tells YouTube that this kind of history deserves a wider audience. I appreciate it. Hiroaki Abe was not a second choice. He was the commander of Battleship Division 11, the officer Yamamoto trusted with the most powerful surface combatants in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had fought at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. By November 1942, he had more combat experience in this theater than almost any flag officer alive. And Yamamoto gave him something he hadn't given Mikawa. He gave him battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, Kongo-class fast battleships, 32,000 tons each. 14-inch guns that could throw a shell more than 20 miles. Ships that had escorted the carriers at Pearl Harbor. Ships that Japan could not afford to lose. The reasoning was sound. If the problem at Savo Island was that cruiser shells hadn't been heavy enough to permanently knock out Henderson Field, then send something heavier. Send something that couldn't be ignored. But here is the detail that changes everything about what happened next. When Abe's force left Truk on November 10th, the main batteries of the Hiei and the Kirishima were loaded with Type 3 shells. Incendiary fragmentation rounds. The kind of ammunition you use to destroy aircraft on a runway. Fuel tanks. Maintenance facilities. The kind of ammunition you load when your target is a shoreside installation, and you are not expecting to fight another warship. Abe was going to shell an airfield. He was not, in his planning, going to fight a naval battle. He had not seriously prepared for the possibility that American warships would be waiting for him inside Ironbottom Sound in the dark. The night of November 12th was black and raining. Abe's force was moving south through heavy weather. Rain squalls breaking up the formation, ships losing visual contact with each other, the flagship struggling to maintain communication with its own screen. What Abe did not know was that Admiral Callahan had taken a force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers into the Sound to stop him. Callahan didn't have battleships. He didn't have anything close to matching Abe's firepower on paper. What he had was determination and the willingness to close to point-blank range. So close that Abe's big guns would struggle to depress low enough to hit him. At 1:24 in the morning, the two fleets stumbled into each other in the darkness at a range of less than 5 miles. What followed was less a naval battle than a collision. Ships were firing in every direction. Destroyers were threading between battleships. The Helena's radar operator was calling out contacts faster than the flagship could process them. Callahan, trying to sort out who was who in the chaos, gave an order that has haunted naval historians ever since. Odd ships fire to starboard, even ships fire to port. In the confusion, some American ships briefly held fire to avoid hitting their own. In that same confusion, the USS San Francisco drove straight toward the Hiei. The two ships passed so close, within a few hundred yards, some accounts say closer, that Hiei's own guns couldn't depress far enough to hit her. San Francisco's crew fired everything they had into the Hiei's superstructure at point-blank range. And one of those shells found the Hiei's steering compartment. It flooded. The steering gear locked. A 32,000-ton battleship began to turn in a slow, helpless circle in the middle of Ironbottom Sound. Abe's men scrambled to switch from fragmentation rounds to armor-piercing. In the chaos of a close-quarters night battle, that took minutes, and in those minutes, San Francisco pulled clear. Callahan died that night. So did Rear Admiral Scott. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. It was, by any tactical measure, a Japanese victory. Abe had won the battle. At 2 in the morning, Abe surveyed what he had. The Hiei, his flagship, was going in circles and could not be steered. His formation had scattered. The Kirishima was still combat-capable, and the path to Henderson Field was open. The American force had been shattered. He ordered the withdrawal. He cited the Hiei's condition. He cited uncertainty about how many American ships were still able to fight. He cited the approach of dawn. The reasoning, again, was not irrational. But Henderson Field was right there. The airfield that had been the entire reason for the mission was 12 miles away, unprotected, with no naval force left to stop him. and Abe turned his ships around. By sunrise, aircraft from Henderson Field and from the carrier Enterprise were circling the crippled Haie. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, wave after wave, all day long. By that evening, the crew had been taken off. Escort destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes. The Hiei went down on the night of November 13th, 1942, the first Japanese battleship lost in the Second World War. Yamamoto relieved Abe of command the following day. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment, because I think about this a lot. Mikawa and Abe were not cowards. They were not incompetent. By the standards of virtually any navy in the world at that time, they were exceptional officers, exactly the kind of men you would want commanding your most powerful ships in your most critical battle. But both of them, at the decisive moment, made the same choice. The path was open. The mission was right there. And both of them pulled back. Not because they were afraid exactly, but because everything in their training, everything in the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy had taught them one thing above all others: preserve the fleet. A warship lost is a warship that cannot be replaced. Protect your ships. Get them home. Fight another day. It was a doctrine that had served Japan brilliantly in the early years of the war. And in Ironbottom Sound, that same doctrine, applied by two of the best men Japan had, kept costing them the one thing they couldn't afford to keep losing: time. This wasn't a failure of nerve. It was a failure of doctrine meeting a situation the doctrine wasn't built for. Yamamoto fired Abe. He needed someone else. He needed someone who would finish the job. He turned to the third admiral. His name was Nobutake Kondō. And I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. Kondō was not chosen because Yamamoto thought he was the best man for the job. He was chosen because by the night of November 14th, 1942, Yamamoto was running out of options. Mikawa had been the brilliant tactician who won a battle and walked away from the war. Abe had been the battleship specialist with a career's worth of combat experience. And he was gone, relieved in disgrace, the Hio already on the bottom of this same sound. Kondō was the senior admiral still standing in the South Pacific. The officers who had served under him described him, and these were his own people, his own colleagues, as what they called an English sort of officer: polished, composed, excellent with his staff, the kind of man who ran a smooth headquarters and gave clear briefings. Better suited, they said, for training command than for battle. Yamamoto sent him anyway, because there was nobody else. On the evening of November 14th, Kondō assembled what he had: the Kirishima, the last remaining battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. His mission was the same mission Mikawa had been given in August, the same mission Abe had failed to complete 36 hours earlier. Get into Ironbottom Sound, shell Henderson Field, get out before dawn. One night. Same mission, same deadline, same trap. What had changed was something Kondō couldn't see and couldn't fully appreciate. In the week since Mikawa had last entered these waters, the United States Navy had been quietly fielding a new piece of equipment. The SG radar, a surface search system that could track warships in total darkness at ranges the Japanese had never encountered. Not the older systems that struggled with clutter and gave ambiguous returns. Something genuinely different. Something that made the night no longer neutral ground. The USS Washington was carrying it, and Washington was waiting. Admiral Willis Lee had been given 2 battleships, the Washington and the South Dakota, and 4 destroyers scraped together from whatever Halsey had available. The destroyers had never trained together. The 2 battleships had operated as a unit for only a matter of days. It was a scratch force, assembled in hours, sent north into waters that had already swallowed dozens of ships. Lee was known throughout the Navy as perhaps its finest gunnery officer. Quiet, methodical, a chain smoker who read detective novels on the bridge between watches. He had won 5 Olympic gold medals in shooting sports in 1920, a fact that his men found oddly reassuring. He entered Ironbottom Sound at dusk and began to wait. Es Falcons. Kondō's force approached around midnight. His ships found Lee's 4 destroyers first and went after them hard. 3 of the 4 were sunk or put out of action within minutes. The 4th limped away, badly damaged. Then the South Dakota's electrical system failed. It was a catastrophic moment of timing. The battleship went briefly dark, and in doing so, she silhouetted herself against a burning destroyer off her port quarter. Japanese searchlights found her almost immediately. Kondō had a lit target and a battleship to shoot at. He ordered everything opened up on the South Dakota. She fought back, but she was taking hits faster than she could track targets. 26 shells struck her in the space of minutes. Her fire control was gone. Her communications were shredded. Her upper works were on fire in 3 places. Kondō may have thought in that moment that the battle was nearly over. He was wrong. While every Japanese gun in the Sound was pointed at South Dakota, Washington was moving. Lee had held her back, letting the destroyers draw fire, using the radar to build a precise picture of every ship in the Sound. Washington had been tracking the Kirishima for several minutes. Her fire control had a solid lock. At 9,000 yards, less than 5 miles, close enough to see the muzzle flashes with the naked eye, Lee gave the order. Washington opened fire. In 7 minutes, 9 16-inch shells, possibly as many as 20 accounts differ, struck the Kirishima. The hits were catastrophic. Her steering was destroyed. Her engine rooms were flooding. She began to list immediately. Kondō ordered the withdrawal. The Kirishima capsized and sank at 3:25 in the morning of November 15th. The second Japanese battleship lost in 48 hours, both of them in the same water. Yamamoto's reaction to Kondō's failure was notably quieter than his reaction to Abe's. He did not relieve Kondō of command. Kondō was the vice commander of the combined fleet, part of the inner circle of the Imperial Navy's senior leadership, with connections and rank that insulated him from the treatment Abe had received. He went back to Truk and kept his command. And the mission that had now cost Japan 2 battleships, dozens of other warships, and the lives of thousands of sailors, was quietly abandoned. Henderson Field was never seriously threatened again. Now we've seen all 3 of them. Mikawa in August, Abe in November, Kondō 24 hours after Abe. 3 different admirals, 3 different nights, 3 different tactical situations. Mikawa won his battle decisively and walked away from the strategic objective. Abe won his battle at enormous cost and pulled back with the target in reach. Kondō lost his battle outright, outmaneuvered by a technology that hadn't existed in this theater 90 days earlier. Each one failed differently. And yet, I keep coming back to the same thing. look at the decisions each of them made. Not the decisions during the battle, but the decisions before they ever entered the Sound. Mikawa planned for a night engagement. He planned his route down the slot, his attack formation, his withdrawal course. He did not plan for what happened if he completed the tactical mission, but the strategic situation was unchanged by morning. Abe planned for a shore bombardment. He loaded the right ammunition for shelling an airfield, calculated his timing to be in and out before dawn. He did not ask, "What do we do if we win the night battle, but the sun comes up before Henderson is destroyed?" Kondō planned for a repetition of what Abe had almost accomplished. He organized his force, assigned his screening units, set his schedule. He did not plan for radar that could see him coming from 9 miles away in complete darkness. None of them planned for the morning. And here is why that matters. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire surface warfare doctrine around a single concept: the night raid. Fast ships, aggressive tactics, close to point-blank range, torpedoes and gunfire in the dark. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and be gone before they can respond. It was a doctrine forged through years of training and genuine tactical innovation, and in the first year of the Pacific War, it worked brilliantly. Japanese destroyers and cruisers routinely outfought Allied forces in night engagements. The Long Lance torpedo was a weapon with no American equivalent. The crews were superb. But that doctrine had a built-in assumption that nobody questioned. The assumption was that a successful night engagement would be decisive. Get in, do maximum damage, get out. The problem at Ironbottom Sound was that maximum damage to the American surface force, even sinking every ship in the water that night, didn't change the fundamental problem. Henderson Field would still be there at sunrise, still operational, still putting planes in the air against anything Japanese that moved. The raid could win the night. It could not win the campaign. To do that, you needed something the doctrine didn't have a word for: sustained presence, control, the willingness to accept losses over multiple nights in exchange for degrading the airfield to the point where it couldn't recover. That's not a raid. That's an occupation. And nobody in Tokyo, not Yamamoto, not the Naval General Staff, and certainly not any of the 3 admirals sent south, ever stopped to ask whether the mission as designed was actually capable of achieving what the mission was supposed to achieve. They kept sending the best men they had, with the wrong orders. That silence, that institutional inability to say this plan cannot work, is what connects Mikawa and Abe and Kondō. Not cowardice, not incompetence. The habit of accepting a fundamentally flawed objective and executing against it with everything they had, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. That is the same way they all failed. Japan began the secret evacuation of Guadalcanal in January 1943. By early February, the last of their soldiers had been pulled off the island. The campaign that had consumed 2 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, 6 months of the combined fleet's fighting strength, and the lives of more than 20,000 men. It was over. It was the last major offensive operation Japan would conduct in the Pacific War. From Guadalcanal forward, they were fighting a retreat. Ironbottom Sound is still there. The Kirishima was found in 1992 by Robert Ballard's expedition, lying upside down in the darkness, her bow blown away by the magazine explosion that had followed the Washington's shells. 4 nautical miles away, the Hiei was found in 2019. Same posture, same fate, inverted, Broken. Both of them missing their bows. 2 battleships that Yamamoto had sent as the best answer he had. Same water, same bottom, same darkness. The Laffey's bow guns are still pointing to port, still aimed at the last place the Hiei ever stood. Henderson Field was paved over decades ago. The runway is now an international airport serving Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. Cargo planes land there in the morning. Tourists fly out in the afternoon. The dead water is quiet. I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. 3 admirals, all handpicked by Yamamoto, all failed the same way. And now that you know what happened, really know it, not just the outline but the detail of those 3 nights. I think the answer is both simpler and harder than it first appears. Mikawa wasn't reckless. He made a reasonable calculation with incomplete information. Abe wasn't timid. He had just won a brutal close-quarters fight, and his flagship couldn't steer. Kondō wasn't unprepared. He was outmatched by a technology that hadn't existed in this theater 90 days earlier. Each of them, judged on their own, made defensible decisions. The failure wasn't in those decisions. The failure was upstream, in the mission itself, in the doctrine that shaped it, in a command culture where no one below Yamamoto had the standing or the willingness to say what needed to be said. One night in Ironbottom Sound will never be enough. We are asking our best men to attempt something that cannot be done the way we are asking them to do it. We need a different answer. That conversation never happened, so they sent Mikawa, then Abe, then Kondō, the best they had, with the wrong mission, into the same water, and the guns of the Laffey are still pointing at the last place the Hiei stood. Nobody moved them. Nobody ever will. I want to ask you something before you go. We've talked tonight about 3 men who accepted a mission that couldn't work, executed it with everything they had, and came up short every time. Yamamoto knew the odds. The admirals knew the trap, and not one of them said what needed to be said. I'm curious, and I mean this genuinely, not as a throwaway question. Is there a moment in this story where you think someone could have changed it? Was there a point where one person, saying one thing, might have broken the pattern? Because I've been thinking about that question for a long time, and I'm honestly not sure I have a clean answer. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and on a story like this, I want to know what you think.